Welcome to The General and the Journalist from The Times and The Sunday Times. The old global order is breaking down, conflict is on the rise, and the world is becoming ever more dangerous.
And we're here to try and make sense of it all each week. You're the general part of the equation, Patrick, General Sir Patrick Sanders.
And you're the journalist, Tom Newton-Dunn.
So where are you this week, Patrick? Because I know you're not sitting beside me here in London.
Well, I'm in Jakarta in Indonesia, Tom, on a busman's holiday. So I'm visiting my son, Kit, and I'm meeting some of the big cheeses here in Indonesia. And the longer I stay here, the more it reinforces just how important this country is in the region.
That sounds fascinating. Do take me with you next time. Interestingly, we worked out actually just before we started recording that it's actually hotter in London than it is in Jakarta at the moment. 32 degrees centigrade here compared to your 30 degrees centigrade.
Yes, Tom, but I've had 2 days of torrential tropical rain, so, don't get too jealous.
On to this week's episode then, in which we're going to talk about Gaza and specifically the Palestinian enclave's full occupation by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, which is a stated new objective of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because his security cabinet has now signed off approval of what Netanyahu says is the first stage of this, which is going to be the occupation of Gaza City, the Strip's most populous city. But, and it is a huge but, the plan has triggered widespread outrage amongst the international community and in Israel itself, with many people who have supported Netanyahu and his hard-right coalition up to this point now feeling it is a move too far and one will only worsen the growing humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, and within Israel itself, the opposition is most notably from the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, who has warned the operation is a mistake and could plunge his forces into a black hole of prolonged risk and responsibility. Yet, Netanyahu has remained steadfast, saying on Sunday that full occupation is the best way to end the war, the best way to end it speedily.
So today we're going to do our best to try to unpack the huge controversy that, and I think it's fair to say this, Patrick, is taking Israel close to a constitutional crisis after almost 2 very long years of war already.
Yeah, the war in Gaza is hugely complex, and we can't and won't try to focus on all of it. But what we will ask is, what exactly would an occupation of Gaza entail? Is it actually achievable militarily? What are the real politics going on here? Is it going to take the IDF to breaking point? And what do we think might happen next?
So just to quickly remind everyone of the facts of the war so far, Israel launched an offensive into Gaza following Hamas's brutal attacks of October the 7th, 2023. On that day, the extremist group killed 1,200 people in Israel and took a further 251 hostages. Since then, more than 60,000 people in Gaza have been killed. That's according to the Hamas-run health ministry, and almost 200 have died of malnutrition or starvation so far since conditions in Gaza started to deteriorate significantly with the start of Israel's block on international aid from March. On Tuesday, the UK, along with Canada and Australia and some others, wrote in a joint statement that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached unimaginable levels. And in terms of the current state of the battlefield, Patrick, we should also point out that the IDF already has control of 75% of Gazan territory, operates freely in most of the Strip. But that's, of course, not the same as occupying it, is it? Because occupation has its own quite specific legal definition, and for good reason.
The term occupation was defined in the Hague Regulations in 1907, and a territory is considered occupied when it's placed under the authority of a hostile enemy. But the key thing to remember here is that an occupying power owes responsibility to the local people. You've got to meet their basic needs. You've got to support public services like medical care and education. And of course, you've got to allow humanitarian aid and relief to take place. And technically, Israel already has these responsibilities because, as you say, Tom, it occupies 75% of the Gaza Strip. But actually, the UN, as well as we, the British, consider that Israel has been occupying Gaza since 1967. So it's always had these duties associated with the term occupation.
And that's a relevant point, Patrick. And a quick tip into history to remind people, Israel did occupy Gaza for some 38 years, from 1967 right through to 2005. So occupation is not a new thing. Why did they do that? Well, actually, back in 1967, Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Israel took it by force during the Six-Day War, which was also against Syria and Jordan, after Israel got intelligence that Arab countries were mobilizing against them. As time went on, occupation got harder and harder, especially since the start of the Second Intifada, or uprising in 2000, when the IDF started to take on quite a lot of casualties, and obviously a lot of Palestinians were then killed. And it all led to the then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon ordering the IDF's withdrawal from Gaza, along with a whole load of Israeli settlements that had been set up there 5 years later. And Patrick, do you know which Israeli politician bitterly opposed withdrawing from Gaza, withdrawing from the occupation at that time?
I don't know for sure, Tom, but I'm guessing that it's one Bibi Netanyahu.
One Benjamin Netanyahu. Spot on.
Yeah. So, of course, it's worth also reminding ourselves that shortly after Israel withdrew unilaterally, the Gaza Strip was kind of subjected to a civil war, if you like, between Fatah and Hamas. And Hamas won that civil war decisively, and they took charge of Gaza. But even after that disengagement, after 2005, Israel still effectively maintained control of the Strip. So they imposed a military blockade, they controlled its borders, and that's why we think of Israel's role in Gaza as being that of an occupying force.
So back to the present day, where we are now and what's about to happen. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is insisting on a full occupation of Gaza all over again. Now, there is a really important conversation to be had, and we will have it in a little bit, on what Netanyahu's real aims are here. For now, though, let's just take Netanyahu at his public word on why he wants this reoccupation. He says it's for two main reasons, and he does have the backing of some far-right politicians and also some ex-members of the military who also support this. So his two main reasons are to disarm and destroy Hamas once and for all, and the second, to see the return of the 20 or so surviving Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas. And an occupation of Gaza, Patrick, argued also by some ex-military figures, after almost 2 years of war, that is their solution for those two remaining big problems which they've started the Gaza fight for in the first place, which, it has to be said, have both failed to achieve so far. Hamas is still up and running, and the hostages are still being held.
Yeah, so I think the short answer is that a military occupation of Gaza is not going to achieve the two objectives that you just described from Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that's why you're seeing this very, very public tension playing out between the IDF, the chief of the IDF, and the government. So the military's assessment is that Hamas are functionally defeated. So they no longer pose a serious threat. They're diplomatically isolated, and they're incapable of ruling Gaza. They effectively, to all intents and purposes, committed suicide as an organization on the 7th of October. So will it achieve these objectives? No, because the likelihood is that any operation to seize Gaza City will also lead to the hostages being killed. And that's what the IDF experienced before. When they were on the ground and they got close to where some hostages were being held unknowingly, Hamas killed those hostages. So this is why, these are the reasons why the head of the IDF has publicly called this operation a mistake. It's also why we need to be questioning the real political objectives that lie behind this. Because as a soldier, military operations have to be connected to clear and achievable political war aims. If you don't understand the aims, you can thrash around not knowing what you're doing. And that famous, everyone's favorite German military philosopher, Karl von Clausewitz, said, war is an extension of politics. So if you don't understand the true political aims, the chances are you can do harm with your military operations.
Okay. Just from an Israeli military perspective, though, say this has to go ahead, say the IDF have to carry it out, what would it take for the IDF to actually go ahead and carry out this occupation, this full occupation?
So I think the first and fundamentally the most important thing is that the IDF have to change their overall approach and their strategy. The key objective for them actually isn't so much about destroying Hamas, it's about preventing Hamas from ever returning to power in Gaza again. Now, the way to do this is through a counterinsurgency strategy. And an insurgency is defined as a campaign by irregular forces, in this case Hamas, to change an existing political order. And these forces, again, Hamas here, typically mingle with civilians to hide from the forces that are defending the political order. So what the IDF have been doing at the moment is very much enemy-centric. Their operations have been focused on destroying Hamas, and they have to shift to a population-centric strategy. That's a strategy that focuses on winning over the public to separate them from the insurgents. So you can go after Hamas, you can go after the insurgents, but you should only do it if it helps increase security for the population so that you can create space to develop legitimate economic and political institutions. If eliminating the insurgents breeds more fighters than it destroys, and arguably that's what's happening at the moment, then doing it is counterproductive.
It may be a misconception and a completely understandable one for people listening to this to think, well, if Israel controls every street, every nook, every cranny, they'll find all of Hamas, they'll kill all Hamas, and they'll find the hostages. The reality is it doesn't work like that, does it? If you have fighters intermerged with the civilian population, it's almost impossible, as we'll get onto this, you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, to find them and work out who they are. And that means the IDF will take casualties, won't they? And Hamas may be broken as a military force, but they're still there, they still have guns. And the IDF cannot do this operation without taking on some significant casualties, can they?
No, they can't. There are definitely going to be casualties, and this is and we'll talk about this, but this is an extraordinarily complex operation to get into. And the IDF are going to face very, very high levels of risk. And at the moment, the way that they've been conducting this campaign has been, in military terms, what we describe as mowing the grass. They've been killing and destroying Hamas militants. They've been killing their commanders, but the way they've been doing it has simply acted as a recruiting sergeant, and more Palestinians, with the extraordinary levels of suffering that they've had to endure for the last 2 years, have ended up joining Hamas. So we can't say at what pace, but they're filling their ranks up almost as fast as the IDF are killing them.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Patrick, and we've had a lot of listeners email us and ask us about just this. Richard was one of them, and he wrote to general journalist at thetimes.co.uk to ask, how have Hamas managed to survive against the best efforts of the Israelis to destroy them?
Well, first of all, as I've just been saying, that they can recruit people to replace the holes that appear in their ranks. But secondly, because they are hidden in and amongst the population. Thirdly, because they've got this incredibly resilient network of tunnels underneath Gaza. I mean, I think about 350 miles or 600 to 700 kilometers of tunnels have been dug beneath Gaza. So there are areas where they can hide and pop up and hide and disappear. And they had very, very substantial weapon stocks. But it's not just the stockpiles and presumably the trickle of arms that are still coming in. It's the fact that they can manufacture a lot of these weapons themselves. They've literally created arms depots and weapons manufacturing inside these tunnel complexes.
Okay, so going back to your point, the IDF need to move from warfighter to counterinsurgency, or COIN as it's known. How does COIN happen? How have we done it in the past successfully?
I mean, so counterinsurgency strategies have had mixed results, but it's worth pointing to two that had really significant levels of success. So first of all, the British in Malaya, fighting the communist insurgents there. And then more recently, the United States during the surge in Iraq, where they completely defeated the insurgency for a period of time. And when we think about counterinsurgency, Tom, we think in terms of three activities. First of all, clear, then hold, then build. So let me just explain this in simple terms. The clear phase is all about re-establishing security of the population. And security is the first problem. Whether it's 10% of the problem or whether it's 80% of the problem, it's the first part of the problem. So you have to start with security and making sure that the insurgents are no longer in the areas that you are physically clearing. And when you look at photographs of Gaza, the films that we've seen of Gaza now, it's harder to imagine a more fiendishly difficult context for urban operations since probably 1945. So you've got this, 350 miles of incredibly well-developed tunnels, the subterranean infrastructure we've just been talking about, factories, the headquarters, all this stuff underground. Then you've got these high rises that have got to be cleared, and you've got to do every single building, every floor, every room, every cellar, every tunnel.
And that's another really interesting point about this conflict, isn't it? Because the IDF have been into these places time and time again over the last 2 or so years. They have cleared to the point that they've reduced this much of it to rubble, and yet Hamas still keep on re-infiltrating through, as you say, that extraordinarily powerful underground network and their astuteness, I guess, in how to keep going. And this has really surprised the Israeli population, hasn't it? In fact, it shocked the Israeli population that they've been in for so long, they've taken so many IDF casualties, and yet the war still keeps on going.
Yeah, Tom, because if you clear an area and then you leave it, don't be surprised if the insurgents re-infiltrate. So once you've cleared an area, you have to hold it. And you have to hold it in a really significant way. So this means literally creating walls, creating gated communities. So as an example, when, as part of the coalition, Fallujah was cleared and this counterinsurgency strategy was applied in Iraq, we created about 12 or 13 gated communities. And that means controlling access. You've cleared it, you're confident that there aren't any insurgents in there anymore. You then wall it off, and then you allow people access through, ideally, biometric ID cards, because you're trying to separate out the enemy, the extremists, the terrorists, from the people who fundamentally just want to live their lives. And then the final phase is it's not enough to clear and hold. You've then also got to build. And my goodness, there's a lot of building that needs to be done in Gaza. So you've got to rebuild the physical infrastructure, the housing, provide people with shelter. You've got to provide the essential services, and you've got to rebuild forms of local political governance. And each of these phases overlap, Tom.
And just simply the way you spell that out there, this is an extraordinarily long and manpower heavy operation. What sort of troop numbers will we be talking about here to do precisely that for the whole of Gaza?
So there's never a clear or simple answer to this. I mean, our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan was that we never had enough. But broadly speaking, the benchmark is that it takes an enormous number of troops. So in our military doctrine, broadly speaking, you're looking at a ratio of about 10 security forces to every insurgent. Or thinking of it a different way, you need about 20 to 25 security personnel per 1,000 inhabitants.
Okay. I mean, it's my primitive maths, a population of 2.3 million in Gaza, 2.3 million Palestinians. That's a force of 45, 50,000. A 10-to-1 troops to insurgents ratio. There are 10,000 troops. That's a 100,000 strong force. These are huge numbers.
Yeah, and it could even be larger than that, Tom, because those are just the frontline elements. And the point about counterinsurgency in this approach is it takes restraint, and it takes patience, and it takes time, and it takes the ability to outlast your enemy. The Taliban famously said, you have the watches, but we have the time. You have to have the strategic patience to outlast them. So broadly speaking, counterinsurgency campaigns last in terms of decades, not years. But the key point, Tom, is that you can do all of that, but it won't work unless there's a route to a political solution, because you have to give the population that you're securing, that you're trying to separate out from the insurgents, an alternative political vision that they believe in. And for the Palestinians, that is statehood. And under this government, I don't see there being a political solution.
Let's just look at the comparatives of the operations you've been involved in, you've led at times. Iraq, you commanded your battalion. We met there in 2007. Afghanistan, you commanded a brigade, both of them counterinsurgency operations. Now, you're honest to admit, and it was quite frankly pretty obvious at the time, I think you might have admitted it then, you didn't have the troops even then anywhere near, certainly in Iraq, to do the proper job. But what else should you or could you or did you wish you had for both those operations?
So I think for me, it was that question of patience. So first of all, making sure that you've got the right troop levels. And then secondly, knowing that the outcome is going to be conditions-based, not time-based. And I think you and I have talked about this before on previous podcasts, but the moment we specified a date that we were going to be leaving in Afghanistan, the campaign was effectively lost. That bringing it down to the soldiers' level, counterinsurgency is incredibly hard because you have to play by rules that the enemy simply don't respect. you've got to exercise restraint. You may see your fellow soldiers, your mates, blown up by roadside bombs, shot at, killed by enemy who don't appear to care whether civilians come under fire or killed and wounded as well. You can't respond when you come under fire with overwhelming force. Knowing that a terrorist is in a block of flats doesn't mean that it's a license to launch an artillery mission or an air mission against it. You can't bomb indiscriminately. You've got to be really precise. You've got to behave in a way that wins the population over, or at least doesn't alienate them further. And you've got to live amongst them. You've got to put their needs and their security at a higher priority than the destruction of the enemy. And often you've got to put their protection and their needs above that of your own. And that's a very, very difficult thing for soldiers who are trained to fight other armies to adapt to.
And your point on time and patience, so it struck me covering Afghanistan and Iraq, and it strikes me even more now that time and patience just isn't something militaries are afforded in the 21st century. In the age of digital, when everything happens in news cycles of 24 hours, the idea of doing something for 10, 20, 30 years is alien, isn't it? But that does also bring us to Northern Ireland, Patrick. Now, that's another operation you served on. Is there a comparison to be made here to the occupation of Gaza?
Let's first of all say where they're very different. I mean, clearly the situation in Gaza is on another level of violence and destruction to anything that we had even in Northern Ireland. It was very, very violent for a while, but nothing like this. But the similarities are that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, just as the IDF have similar levels of responsibility for Gaza. So when it's so critical to your country's security, you have not just the imperative, but you have the political freedom to think in very long term, think in these decades of solving a problem. And I think one of the reasons that Gaza hasn't worked for the Israelis is they haven't thought long term. For soldiers, these sort of operations are more straightforward for professional armies. That's volunteer armies to deal with. But when you've got conscript armies, as the Israelis do, it's much harder, because I think conscripts buy that they will be mobilized when there is an extreme threat, but they don't expect to be mobilized routinely, where they almost may as well have become part of the army. And they don't have the warrior ethos necessarily that professional soldiers do, because they're part civilians as well. So there's much more of a burden on the government to make sure that the army buys into the underpinning logic, the overall strategy of what they're trying to pursue. They have to nurture popular support.
That's a really interesting point. So you think it's a lot harder to get conscript armies to do stuff than it is to get volunteer armies, in your experience, which is, after all, what the majority of the IDF is made up for?
No, I think you can tell professional soldiers what to do, and as long as it's legal, they'll do it. When it comes to conscript armies, I think there is much more of a burden on the government, in this case, the government of Israel, to really persuade civilian soldiers that spending arguably the next decade or 2 decades occupying Gaza and operating in the way that I described and exercising restraint is something that's in the national interest.
Before we leave Northern Ireland, just out of interest, what was your most difficult memory from your 3 tours there?
I think my worst memory was in Belfast, where I was commanding a company, so about 120 soldiers, and we were in support of the police, and it was marching season. You remember each year the Protestants, the Orangemen, would conduct their right to march and play their bands to celebrate the Battle of the Boyne through predominantly Catholic areas. And there was always violence around these things. So the police plan on this occasion was that we would occupy the route for a period of 3 days. And we locked down that route, which meant denying people who didn't have the right form of identification or voter registration papers access to their homes. And I felt dirty. It was a really unpleasant thing to do. And in some respects...
Dirty? What do you mean dirty?
I didn't like the idea that in a part of the United Kingdom, I, as an armed soldier, was preventing people from getting to their homes. It just didn't square with my view of, if you like, the nobility of the profession of arms.
It's interesting. And that, of course, is going to be a scenario played out day after day after day by the IDF if they do end up occupying Gaza. And this is on top of, let's also remember, a really hard, almost 2 years of war they've already been fighting in the Strip. And they're tired. They say they're tired. It's obvious they're tired. Suicide rates are rising. Times Israel reported that last year saw the highest number of soldier suicide, 21, and that's the highest in over a decade. Desertions are increasing too. And then there's a question of where they're going to get all this new manpower from. Those sort of numbers we were just talking about, 50, 100,000 new troops from somewhere to do this occupation. So the IDF has roughly 100,000 active duty soldiers at the moment, the majority reservists, as we were discussing. They've already called up 300,000 since the start of the fighting after October the 7th, 2023. They've said that could increase to 450,000. But, Patrick, all that is from a population of just below 10 million. You know, that's almost getting on to 1 in 20 in uniform. They could actually run out of young men and women to call up at one stage. And that's going to be a problem. And morale is going to be a problem, isn't it? Because an army that is fed up of fighting at some stage may actually refuse to fight.
So I wouldn't go that far, Tom. I would be astonished if an army that is as professional as the IDF has been would refuse to fight. But I think what you are seeing, and this is perhaps why the chief of staff of the IDF has so publicly disagreed with this plan, is that he has deep concern about the sustainability of the operations that they're on. As you said it yourself, the reservists have been mobilised 3 or 4 times in some cases. They've been on extraordinarily difficult level deployments. They've seen friends killed and wounded. They're exhausted. And there's historical memory of Gaza. You know, the IDF were in Gaza before, securing some of the Jewish settlements that were there, trying to provide some framework security. And it was an enormously unpopular mission, both inside the IDF and inside the country. And it's not what the IDF are optimized for. You know, they are optimized to fight Hezbollah, to fight Iran, to see off potentially invading armies. For the long period of time that the IDF did occupy Gaza, there is a view inside the IDF that this counterinsurgency approach actually weakened their edge. It made them more vulnerable to Iran and Hezbollah. And then for these reservists, you know, the truth is that counterinsurgency, the strategy I was describing earlier on, only really works effectively when individual soldiers stay in the area they're responsible for a very long period of time. So the idea that you'd be able to rotate them every few weeks or every few months fundamentally undermines it. So once you're deployed there, you should stay there for a long time. That's not popular.
Well, look, that's where General Zamir and a lot of his fellow senior officers, it would appear, are. They don't want the occupation because it won't get the hostages back. It won't destroy Hamas. And there are all those legal imperatives on an occupying army to feed, provide shelter, etc., as we've discussed. But there's one more, isn't there, as well, Patrick? And that's their real fear, that it will only increase what is already a humanitarian catastrophe. So the Gaza Strip, it's a small strip of land, actually, 41 kilometres long, 10 kilometres wide. It's tiny, but 2.3 million people stuffed into it. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth after places like Macau and Singapore. And General Samir and the others fear that a worsened humanitarian situation will further alienate Israel from their international allies, Britain, France, Germany, the people who have stood by Israel for decades, leaving just one ally left, really, the one country that is yet to criticize the idea of reoccupation, and that's the United States. And if they alienate the United States, Donald Trump under ever more pressure on this, then they really have got a problem, haven't they?
I mean, what the IDF have been doing in Gaza has already caused immense destruction and humanitarian suffering. The decision to cut off the aid back in March has caused starvation, immense suffering. The idea that that would then be extended further into Gaza City before the existing humanitarian crisis has been resolved is unthinkable. And we're seeing at the moment how Israel has gone from a nation that had victim status, that held the moral high ground after the massacres on 7th of October, to now being an international pariah. I mean, the idea that the Germans would cut off arms supplies, that the British and the French governments would consider recognizing Palestine when they've never done it before, it tells you just how isolated Israel has become because of what's going on in Gaza at the moment.
And we're going to get into the politics of that and why precisely Netanyahu has got himself into this position. But finally, on the business of the military occupation first, though, it's difficult to not observe that despite all the great rhetoric from Netanyahu, the security camp's decision to go ahead with the first stages to occupy Gaza City, very little has actually happened on the ground. There's been no new call-up of troops, which they would need, as we've just discussed. There's been no warning to civilian population they might need to evacuate, which is what the Israeli military, the IDF, have done before in all their clearance operations in Gaza so far. It's almost like there isn't a plan. There's no battle plan to actually do this. Yes, there's been some shaping operations in the last day or so, some quite heavy bombing around Gaza City, but it's almost like Netanyahu doesn't feel he's quite able to press the button on this yet, Patrick. What do you think?
Well, I think the IDF had a plan, which was to isolate Gaza City and then to conduct, precision raids into it to deal with, Hamas cells when they could identify them, but avoid putting the hostages in further danger. That was the military plan. What Netanyahu and his government have done is to sort of throw out this quite general term around, reoccupation of Gaza, occupation of Gaza City, without being really clear what the political objectives are and what the military objectives are. So I'm not surprised, first of all, that the military have pushed back. I'm surprised that they pushed back publicly, that it's broken out into the public domain. But if I was sitting in General Zamir's shoes, I would be having exactly the same conversation saying, well, hang on, what is it you need me to achieve? This is actually not going to achieve what you're trying to do. Tell me what your objectives are. And that dialogue, I think, will have caused Netanyahu to have realized that he can't move rapidly and he needs to just slow it back a bit.
Right, well, let's get into the politics of all this, because it really is fascinating. It's intensely complex, quite frankly, as Israeli politics always is. I remember visiting the Knesset a few years ago and just simply trying to get my head around the 15, 20 different political parties that exist in Israel. So you try and understand Israeli politics at your peril, but we're going to give it a go. As you say, immense opposition to this occupation led by none other than the IDF's chief of staff himself, General Zamir. And that has prompted a really delicate and dangerous situation in Israel. Yagil Levy, who's an Israeli political scientist, said this about it. He's called it the most severe crisis in the history of relations between the political echelon and the military since the 1948 war, when Israel was founded. Never before has the political leadership compelled the military to execute an operation it adamantly opposed. So if you're a military leader, you don't like what a democratically elected politician is telling you to do. What do you do about it, Patrick?
Well, there's a difference between what you do in public and what you do in private. And as you're developing military options and military strategy, and in conversations these are conversations that happen in the UK within COBRA, in the National Security Council, between ministers, the defence chiefs, in particular CDS, is always involved. And sometimes the military are very forward-leaning. We're can-do. We have a culture that says, yes, we can do this. We want to respond to political imperatives. It's our default setting. We are subordinate to political direction. But within that, there is also a duty to be honest and to be super clear with politicians, where reaching for the military instrument of power, trying to find a military solution, isn't always the right one. And sometimes it may be completely the wrong one. But it all comes down to what the political objectives are. The first question you ask yourself, if you're being asked to do something that, despite all of your military advice saying this is the wrong thing to do, the next step is you ask yourself, is this legal? And, there's a good historical example of that. So in the lead up to the Second Gulf War, when there was a lot of debate around the intelligence basis for this war, and you'll remember all of that, and whether or not there was a sort of legal framework for going to war. The chief of the defence staff, Sir Admiral Mike Boyce, who died recently, asked for legal advice from the Attorney General. Is what I am being told to do by the government legal? And we've seen all of the debate, both then and since then, where people still aren't sure whether it was or wasn't. So you can do that. The problem is, in Israel, the judiciary is under immense political pressure. So you can't be totally confident in Israel that you're getting the objective legal advice that you're entitled to as the armed forces.
Admiral Boyce, you mentioned there, my little tuppence on that, just after 9/11, when he was Chief Defence Staff, he had lunch with defence correspondents. I went along to that. And he said to us very candidly, we said, well, look, it looks like we're about to get involved in a war in Afghanistan, join this war on terror that George Bush has just declared. To which he said, yes, if that's what we're asked to, we'll do it. But I think people should just be aware it could last for 20 or 30 years. And that went down like an absolute sack of spuds in Downing Street. Tony Blair was livid, gave him a thorough reprimand. He only did, I think, 2 years of CDS. His term was slightly foreshortened because he had the temerity to tell the truth publicly. But it was a similar situation. He never opposed the order, but he clarified very publicly what he thought that would entail. And guess what? He was right. 20 years on, we're still fighting counterinsurgency, counter-terrorist operations in these sort of parts of the world.
Yeah, and it is the duty of the Chief of the Defence Staff of the day, and backed up by the chiefs, to deliver objective military advice, politically aware military advice, but to tell it like it is to politicians. Just as ultimately, if the order is legal, it's also our duty to implement what the political direction is. And there's an expression for this. It's called an unequal dialogue. But the point is, you need a dialogue. You need tension, you need debate, you need argument, often very robust, inside, secret rooms about the rights or the wrongs of a particular course of action. But it never breaks out into public in the way that it has in Israel.
And that's the big difference. And do you know what? I'm really personally conflicted here because I have to say, as a political journalist, defence journalist, I have profited for 30 years from senior military officers saying things out of turn, criticising government policy, etc. It's a great source of stories. But as much as I might admire General Samir for standing up to Netanyahu, what appears to many of us, you and I, an appalling idea, it does also strike me what he's doing here is rather undemocratic because he hasn't kept his criticisms private. Whether he has said them publicly or not, he's made them very clear and he has found a way for them to enter the media. He's therefore playing politics himself. He's influencing Israeli public opinion to see the ends he would like rather than the ends that the elected Israeli government would like. And whether he's right or wrong, and we might think we're on his side on this, it's a fairly undemocratic thing to do, isn't it?
Well, so there's another version of this, isn't there, which is that they had a very robust internal debate inside the war cabinet. That debate was then leaked by other politicians, and that then put Zamir in a position where he was, he had to respond publicly. So it slightly depends. It's a bit who said, she said, but my understanding is they had a robust debate. Zamir expected it to remain within those circles, and it was leaked for political reasons.
Out of interest, Patch, have you ever been in that situation? I mean, look, I'm sure you have a row with politicians all the time when you were in the MOD throughout your career, but have you ever been put into a situation where you thoroughly disagree with what a politician is asking you to do? It may involve a life or death matter, but you believe it to be utterly wrong.
So there's two different types of debate that you have. There are those around decisions about whether you use military force in the first place. So a good example of that recently has been, whether or not we should use Royal Navy ships and military personnel to deal with migrants, whether in the Channel or processing them. And I can't speak for the rest of the chiefs, and I won't. But from my perspective, there were two things that mattered. The first is the Royal Navy should always respect safety of life at sea. So you don't want to be turning sinking ships around. I mean, that is not what the Royal Navy is for. And secondly, I don't think soldiers, sailors, or aviators should act as border force. Those are just fundamentally, it's not our role. So there are still political voices for the military to be used. And I'm quite happy to say that there's an example of where I thought it would be wrong to use military force. And then you've got
made
decisions.
That point internally.
Yeah. And then you've got
and that
decisions
never ended up
that are
happening.
taken.
So you won that.
So far, Tom. And it's not about winning and losing. It's about making a case and politicians listening. So I think you have to give the government of the day credit for listening and and respecting those views, and perhaps they had them too. But it was a good, robust debate. And then you have decisions around the use of the conduct of operations. Do we have enough of something? Should we be doing this? Can we deploy this equipment? And I'm not going to get into specifics because I suspect they're still at a higher level of classification. But as Commander Task Force Helmand, and then subsequently as the Director of Operations in the MOD, there were some things about the campaign in Helmand that we were doing at political direction that I fundamentally objected to and said so. Tom, what about the political response from within Israel? I mean, its people have, up until now, generally been very supportive of the IDF's operations in Gaza, but this new notion of yet another operation to take Gaza City, that seems to have much less support. I mean, how do you read that?
It does have less support. The polling is really interesting that's sort of coming out over the last sort of week or two. The Israeli population are quite notably against a reoccupation of Gaza. There was a poll by the Times of Israel, for example, 53% opposed occupation, 39% supported it, and the rest didn't really know. Polls also reveal that the Israeli public now really do favour a deal with Hamas, quite clearly favour a deal for the release of the hostages rather than fighting to release them, because that just clearly hasn't worked so far. It has got some released, it's got others killed. And most interestingly, and they carry a lot of weight, the hostage families are dead against this. They think, and they've said, Netanyahu is leading Israel and the hostages to doom, their words. And in fact, they're calling for a nationwide strike this coming Sunday. They're so worried about the prospect of reoccupation, what that will do to their loved ones still being held. And I would say, Patrick, and I'd argue that all that is giving General Zamir the support he needs to keep opposing this occupation. If the population, quite frankly, were 90% in favour, he'd just have to get on with it.
So, I mean, it begs the question then, Tom, why is Netanyahu doing this? I mean, especially if you don't take his reasons for occupying Gaza at face value.
Well, I think that is the heart of everything, isn't it? And, you know, I've tried to be fair to those arguing for an occupation. I think there is a military case for it in that they've tried everything else. You have to have complete ownership of everything to totally eradicate Hamas and find people. I agree with you that it will backfire terribly and it's a 30-year job, if anything. But I can see the military case for that. I personally don't believe Netanyahu is persuaded of it, though. There's been a lot of reporting from internally in Israel, Israeli politics, and there are two other reasons why he might be pushing for a full occupation. Both of them are pretty cynical. The first is the political trap, if you like, that he's in. He's in this coalition with the far right. He needs a few of their MPs to give him a majority with his Likud party to get over the line. And the far right see this as their moment to really push Palestinians pretty much out of Israel altogether. And they will keep pushing for that, which means a forceful solution, which means the fighting continues. So that's his sort of political trap. The second reason why he might want this is the forever war argument, which we sort of touched on a bit earlier. Israel has to keep fighting someone for as long as they possibly can. The reasons being for Netanyahu personally, and this really is cynical, he would be able to keep on arguing for the continued suspension of his corruption trial. He's currently being tried for corruption charges, fraud charges, and the like. That has been suspended at the moment while this emergency situation continues. Arguably, it's a very, very good reason to keep the fighting going. We don't know this, Patrick, but that's absolutely the political sense that you talk to people from Israel, Israeli opinion formers, some Israeli politicians, that's certainly what they very much think.
Yeah, I mean, this proposed operation makes no military sense to me at all. I think there's a third reason, and that is that for his whole career, Netanyahu's prime directive, if you like, his strategy has been to deny any possibility of Palestinian statehood. That's been his defining vision for 25 years. So I think he's framing this operation as being necessary militarily. I mean, we've debated that. I don't think it is. But I think that's the real reason behind this. And this sounds a terrible thing to say, but ultimately I don't think he cares enough politically. He may personally, but doesn't care enough politically, because the price he would have to pay to get those hostages back is unacceptable to him, because he won't trade them for Marwan Barghouti or the release of Palestinian prisoners. So I agree. I think there are I think we're tapping deep levels of cynicism here.
Yep. And that is where we are.
So, Tom, shall we go back to where we started and let's answer that question? Do you think that an occupation is achievable? And what do you think is going to happen next?
Okay. Well, we must conclude this. And do you know what? I think we're in vague danger of breaking out in almost broad agreement here. Militarily, yes, an occupation is achievable because you've spelt out the hows and wherefores. But practically, I think the answer is overwhelmingly no. Also, for the reasons we spelt out, a huge amount of forces, a huge amount of time, none of which Netanyahu currently has. And crucially, he's got no mandate or popular support to do this. And as long as the military know that, as long as the generals and emirs as well know that, they can and will keep obfuscating him. So for all of those reasons and everything we discussed, I just don't think this is going to happen. It's one of those things that now appears to me the reoccupation of Gaza is just politically untenable. What about you, Patrick? What do you think? And is it doable and will it happen?
I think it's doable in the sense that they're already doing it. I mean, they're occupying 75% of Gaza. The only difference between the IDF's plan and Netanyahu's plan is that this is talking about clearing the remaining part of Gaza, Gaza City, not small in itself, that the IDF don't occupy. And the military plan was to isolate it and then conduct raids and set the conditions for negotiation. So on multiple levels, the IDF are already occupying Gaza, but the idea that there will be, a full clearance operation and then a long-term occupation involving the sort of counterinsurgency strategy that I described. No, I agree with you, Tom, but I don't see a strategy here. I see, other than a political strategy involving denying Palestinian statehood and ensuring Bibi's survival, I think the military are simply a pawn in that wider political game at the moment. This reminds me of one of the more memorable phrases that the great Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu came up with. And I think we're seeing it play out now, Tom. So strategy without tactics is the slow route to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I don't think there is a long-term strategy here. I think this is about military activities that aren't connected to a long-term solution for the question of Palestine.
Okay. I'm going to take that Sun Tzu quote away and think about it, actually, because I think it's really rather clever. Podcast listeners can play it back. I'll have to wait for the recording to listen to it, but thank you for that. And that is it. We are, I think, just about in agreement on what is a really, really tricky issue, and it's not going to stop here, sadly. That is it for this week. If you have a question or just want to tell us something, please do email us at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. We read all of them. We'll feature some of the best ones in episode to come or in the Times' new weekly newsletter, War and Peace, which is written by me, I have to say, and free to all Times subscribers. And you can find our terms and conditions at thetimes.com. So until next week, thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom. And let me just endorse what you say, because I've been reading your weekly newsletter, War and Peace, and I think it is quite excellent.
You are very kind. And for that, thank you again, Patrick.